Well, welcome everybody. I'm glad to welcome you to our first morning workshop. I think this series is entitled Scholarship for Practitioners, and then there'll be some more workshops later to follow, which get down to some of the practices. But we'll hear about some theory regarding different aspects of classical education. And we're excited to have you all here. We're excited to have our guests here today. My name is Zach Withers. I've been working for Great Hearts Academies for 12 years. I'm currently the headmaster of Anthem Preparatory Academy, which is our most northern academy here in Phoenix. We'll hear a couple of talks here today, and we'll kind of follow the same pattern. And so we'll first hear from Dr. Schlect about declamations, the rhetorical practice of declamations. We'll hear a talk from him, and then we'll have some time. We'll all start some Q&A questions. We'll take some from the audience. During that time, that mic does work, and so you can use that for the Q&A portion. And then we'll conclude that first session, and then we'll switch over to a talk from Tracy Lee Simmons, the author of Climbing Parnassus. So we're glad to have him here, and it's the 20th anniversary of that work, so he'll be talking to us about that work 20 years later. I think there are some practical things. Let me just check the notes. There was a note in this PowerPoint slide here. Oh, here we go. It's about lunch, so I think that's important. Let's see, where was it? Oh, here, it is on the front. Sorry, this was up here, now we moved it. It looks like, okay, so we are asking if you have the WOVA app to actually register for the session, just so you can give feedback on it and do the Q&A there. And then also, for lunch, we'll head back toward the ballroom area. I think there's one more session and then lunch, and there'll be some food out in the front lobby before the ballroom, and then you can head into the ballroom there, and we'll have a session during the lunch hour. Okay, great. All right, so let me just introduce our first guest here. Dr. Schlect is a friend and colleague, and so I've had the privilege of studying under him. But he's worked in classical education for over 30 years. At his home institution, New St. Andrews College, he served as the head of Humanities and director of the college graduate program in classical and Christian studies, which I highly recommend you check out. He regularly teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in history and historiography, education and classical rhetoric, among other subjects. He has also taught history at Washington State University, and presently serves on the faculty of Gordon College's Classical Graduate Leadership Program. In addition to his work in the collegiate level, Schlect has many years of teaching experience in high school. He serves as a serves classical and Christian schools around the country through his consulting and teacher training activities. He and his wife, Brenda, have 5 grown children, all products of a classical and Christian education, and as well as their spouses, and a number of grandchildren, which continues to grow. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Schlect.
Well, it's a delight to be here. This is my first time here at the Great Hearts Summit, and I hope we have some rhetoric practitioners in here. I will say that this is sort of a part one of a part two. We'll see how well this goes over here, but in the next session in this room is going to be more of a workshop to flesh out some of the things that I'm outlining here by way of introduction. We all know, I think that, let's see, here we go. Oh, look at that. We all know that rhetoric is important. I trust that you're here because of that conviction. A lot of us are doing good things with it, but as I travel from school to school, I do find in the classical education world a rather dizzying variation in the classroom practices, in rhetorical cultures. Some schools have adopted a hardened orthodoxy when it comes to rhetoric, but their orthodoxy runs contrary to the orthodoxy of the school in the next county. Our revival of classical education, I think, is too immature for orthodoxies like that to set in. We need to remember Cicero's orations against Catiline were not built in a day. And so I think we need to rethink rhetoric, and hopefully I'll offer some thoughts as we move forward in that project. And one place I see this is the way many of our schools throw a massive emphasis into this capstone thesis project. These are usually scaled down high school versions of master's theses or doctoral dissertations. I'm curious, those of you in the room, how many of you are familiar with capstone thesis projects? Oh, yes, well, this is where I'll be more provocative than I really intend to be, but I don't know, we live in a society of clickbait, and so I'll get clickbaity about my attitudes toward thesis. These are the only difference between, master's thesis or doctoral dissertation is that they're cumbersomely organized with a structure that goes exordium, narratio, partitio, confirmatio, confutatio, and all the rest, right? But I can see Cicero and Quintilian rolling over in their graves because that is a structure that was never intended to fit the sort of research thesis that we shackle it into. And then our students' theses don't turn out to be as impressive as we hoped they might be. They didn't quite fulfill our aspirations. And so we find ourselves pursuing a couple of remedial strategies for this. One of the remedial strategies is to double down on the high standards, which imposes, the unrealistic burden upon the poor teacher who oversees those senior theses. We expect teachers to undertake personalized hand-holding for each student, even though each student's project is unique, takes up a rather specialized domain of knowledge with its own literature, its own methods of proof, lines of evidence unique to the field. These unfortunate thesis advisors perform close editing on a whole classroom's worth of drafts. This is inhumane treatment of a teacher. The second strategy is to spread out the thesis process, maybe for the entire senior year. So in November, you write the introduction, and then the narratio in December, and then the proofs in January and February, and so on, which is, of course, a fragmented approach that introduces a conceptual separation between parts and whole. And that becomes all too apparent in March and April when they roll around and complete drafts are due. These are, of course, the worst months on the senior thesis calendar for everybody. Whatever strategy we adopt, we find ourselves straying further and further away from the classical tradition of eloquence. And so I propose actually turning away from that approach that's modeled after the modern research university and recover the classical tradition on this point. And so this is the provocative statement here that we must recover declamation exercises in our schools. And if we don't do this, we're going to perpetuate our uncomfortable divergence from the classical tradition of eloquence. Now, I use the term declamation as the Romans understood the term, and my project today is to try to help you see what it is that I'm talking about with these exercises. Declamations are training exercises in eloquence, exercises that mark the capstone of rhetorical instruction in ancient Rome. In Roman schools, all elementary instruction progressed up to declamations. They're the capstone exercises that progymnosmata were building up to. Now, how many of you in your schools are working with progymnosmata exercises? Okay, a few of you are, very good. Now, my own experience has shown that by assigning declamation exercises to my students, I've come to more deeply understand the progym exercises that build up to it. Quintilian and other Roman teachers, I think, would be puzzled today to find our classical schools stopping at these preliminary progym exercises without advancing to declamations. It wouldn't have made any sense to them. It's the instructional equivalent of a piano teacher assigning scales and fingering exercises to his students without ever letting the students play an actual song. Or imagine a basketball coach working his team through ball handling drills, but he never allows his players to play an actual game. If ball handling drills become ends in and of themselves, siloed off from the actual game of basketball, then the drills actually become rather strange and perverse and warped. Now, a good coach, on the other hand, the one who understands the game and is preparing students for the game, his team for the game, this is a coach whose players are going to get the most benefit out of these ball handling drills because the ball handling drills are tailored to actual game play, and it affects the way the ball handling drills go. Rhetoric teachers who assign declamations are the teachers who appreciate what progymnosmata worked up to, just like the ball handling drills in the hands of a good coach. These are the teachers who are best equipped to assign progymnosmata with purpose. I think for the sake of the earlier exercises, we need to recover declamation as the proper capstone. In ancient Rome, parents and patrons evaluated teachers according to how well their students declaimed. Declamation exercises were such a mainstay that, in common parlance, the Latin word declamatio became a shorthand way of referring to the entire Roman curriculum, or the entire rhetoric curriculum. Not only did declamations prepare Roman students for public life, mature statesmen practiced these exercises to stay on top of their game. Suetonius says this. He says, Cicero continued to declaim in Greek as well as Latin up to the time of his praetorship, and in Latin even when he was getting on in years. Suetonius goes on to name a number of other prominents, including Pompey, Mark Antony, and Augustus, all of whom practiced declamations over the course of their political careers as a way of honing their rhetorical effectiveness. It's like Michael Jordan practicing. He did practice basketball and not just play games. So consider here what Quintilian had to say. Here's a quote from Quintilian. He says, I must say a little about the general principles of declamation, the last to be invented of all the exercises. But note this, but by far, he says, the most useful because it both embraces in itself all the things of which we have been speaking and provides the closest image of reality. So Quintilian's saying that everything you teach in rhetoric is brought to bear in a single declamation exercise. He goes on, consequently it has become so popular that many think that it is sufficient by itself for the formation of an orator. Now this is a misunderstanding he's trying to correct, but rhetoric teachers in his day actually funneled too much into declamation, he said, because it was the capstone, and this is the big takeaway, that he said they neglected the preliminary exercises to rush to declamation. I think we have the opposite problem. We have the preliminary exercises without the capstone. Nonetheless, that's how Quintilian puts it. So he says if you're teaching declamations, you are teaching everything that can be taught. You are reviewing and recovering everything in the rhetoric curriculum. He says, listen to this, no excellence, or at least no excellence of continuous speech can be found, which is not also to be found in this type of practice oration. All right, so what are declamations? And I'm going to spend the rest of my time just introducing what these exercises are. I want to begin with a sample problem. And I've got some other sample problems on the handout here. But this is one, it's not on the handout, it appears, but this I'll work with is an illustration here. It's a sample declamation problem. The law states that a disinherited son shall have a share in his father's property. It also states that a man who remains on board a ship abandoned during a storm shall become owner of the ship. Two laws here. A disinherited son remains on board his father's ship when it is abandoned during the storm. So who gets the ship, father or son? Do you see that? All right, so this is the prompt, and the student's task is to deliver a speech in favor of either the father coming away with the ship or the son coming away with the ship. That's the whole challenge right there. Now, This is the 2022-23, I mislabeled the slide here, debate resolution. But I want to contrast this with policy debate that you may be familiar with here. This is actually from the National Federation of High School Associations. Resolved, the United States federal government should substantially increase its security cooperation with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in one or more of the following areas: artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and cybersecurity. Okay, this is a debate resolution that we might be familiar with if we're having debate societies in our schools. And I want you to imagine, sort of backfill what a student needs to do in order to prepare for this debate resolution. If you're familiar with debate, and policy debate in particular, I think students really prevail by out-footnoting the other side. That's really what it amounts to. And that's what this resolution calls for. It calls for research. They need to figure out and learn about NATO. They need to find out about artificial intelligence and biotech and cybersecurity. Now, back to Hermogenes, what are you going to Google for this? Research what books? This is all the students have. And then they're enjoined to prepare a speech of maybe 7 to 10 minutes. What are they going to have to do? They're going to have to invent arguments. Coming back with the old style sense of invention. One of the problems today confronting students is not the presence of information. Students are deluged with information, and research skills, I think, tend to be overrated today. What students need is to understand probative value, relevance, competency and relevance in evidence. They need to know how to curate evidence rather than just find evidence and sort and build and tackle it. And declamation exercises force this. Like, how do you craft an argument? And so if I'm a student confronted with this, how do I build my speech for this? Let's say that my task is I'm going to argue for the sun. How do we approach the problem? Well, the ancients would take us then to stasis theory. Stasis theory. And this is going to bring us to this fellow, Hermagoras of Temnos. He studied various judicial disputes. And for all the variety of disputes that are out there, and there's an infinite variety out there, he reasoned that there are certain patterns that emerge. And if you study the patterns, if you recognize you can organize disputes according to certain patterns, and if you study these patterns, then you can build arguments tailored to the particular pattern. And I want to show you how this works. Okay, so the word stasis refers to the point of contention where accusation meets up defense. So you're pulled over, and the police officer comes to the car window and says, "You crossed over into the oncoming lane of traffic," right? Now, you don't think that you should be ticketed here, right? So we don't have a disagreement yet. We need to hear the other side. The motorist says, "I did no such thing. I never left my lane." All right, so it didn't happen. You saw something different, officer. But notice this one here. All right, same accusation. You crossed over into the oncoming lane of traffic. Yes, but I was avoiding a huge pothole that would have damaged my tire. Now, I want you to recognize in the first instance and in the second instance, both sides agree on what the law says. In the first instance, they disagree on what actually occurred factually. In the second instance, they agree on what occurred factually, but the defendant is introducing an additional consideration, a mitigating circumstance. Okay, so this fits a different pattern. Now notice this. You crossed over into the oncoming lane of traffic. Yes, I did. What's wrong with that? The law doesn't forbid that. So you see, we've got accusation, defense, but this is yet a different line of contest here. Now they're not agreeing, unlike the first two, they're not agreeing on what the law says. And that's the basis for the disagreement. So these are three patterns, three different patterns. And the ancients would call the first pattern, when you disagree over whether or not something occurred, that's a conjectural issue. In the second case, this is a juridical issue. I'm following the terminology of the Rhetorica ad horennium here. That's a juridical issue where the disagreement hinges on the scope of relevance in facts here. So it's a mitigating circumstance. And then the third is a legal issue over the meaning of the law. All right. Now, if you identify which pattern your disagreement falls into, then the ancients gave us a repository of strategies tailored to conjectural issue, or strategies for juridical issues, strategies for legal issues, and then you can build your speech following those strategies. All right, so back here, the law states that a disinherited son shall not have a share in his father's property. It's the same scenario. Okay, is this conjectural, juridical, or legal? Okay. Is there any disagreement over the facts that actually took place? No. So rule out conjectural. It's not conjectural. Do they agree on what the law says as it bears on this case? No. We've got conflicting laws. This is going to be one of the varieties of legal issue. Legal issues can be issues of their subtypes, definition, conflicting laws, or letter and spirit. This is a legal issue. The ancients would call this a legal issue of conflicting laws. Okay. I mean, these laws might not be in conflict, but in the presence of this fact pattern, now they come into conflict, right? All right, so how do we build our speech? Well, we'll follow the strategies that the ancients advised, and I want to illustrate this then. And I'm going to basically finish with this. This is what a student might develop. This is something that I worked up when I was on an airplane here on my way to a conference. So I've got my parts of speech over on the left, and then I'm going to click so you can actually see the different elements that just following ancient patterns here. All right, so I'm arguing on behalf of the son. I'm arguing on behalf of the son. My grandmother was a frugal woman. Whenever she bought paper napkins, I remember this, she took scissors to each individual napkin to cut it in half. That way it would take twice as long to get through a package of paper napkins. You see, she came of age during the Great Depression. She dropped out of school after the 8th grade so she could get a job to help out her family. She stretched resources and didn't let anything go to waste. And I used to think that it was kind of weird that she cut paper napkins to stretch those. Aren't napkins cheap? You see, I came of age in a material world of plenty. I grew up in the suburbs, lots of disposable stuff. We'd use something, we'd cast it aside, we'd move on. And only later did I come to appreciate my grandparents' frugality. Their generation endured hardships, the hardships of depression and a world war. We can learn a thing or two from my grandmother about taking care of what we have. And this is really what today's case is about, stewardship. Members of the jury, your job today will be to make a decision based on the principle of stewardship. I represent Mr. Theodore Withers, a young man who is being sued by his own father. Theodore's father, Zach Withers, is the headmaster of Great Heart's Anthem. And this elder Withers is marshaling the legal resources at his disposal to seize the property of his own son, my client. As Theodore's representative in this case, I won't ask you to step into a family quarrel. You can steer clear of family politics if you fix your gaze upon the principle of stewardship. What is best for the property? What do our laws say about stewardship of property? If you keep stewardship at top of mind, which our laws embrace, then I'm confident you'll find in Theodore's favor. Last year, the Withers family moved from their former home in Phoenix up to the Pacific Northwest. They made their way to the Pacific coast and then traveled by water up the coast into the mouth of the Columbia River, heading inland from there. But along the voyage, they encountered a couple of unhappy storms. The first storm was a family dispute that left young Theodore estranged from his father. And the second was a literal storm that tossed their ship as they were trying to make their way over the Columbia Bar. Now, Theodore's father is a schoolmaster by profession, and he's devoted his life to classical learning. This elder Withers is not given to conflict. He prefers to walk away from storms rather than confront them. That's the way he handles difficulty with his son, as many fathers do with their sons, and Mr. Withers simply disinherited him. So as their ship made its passage toward the mouth of the Columbia, the weather turned. Water crashed over the rail onto the deck. Theodore looked over at his father, and he saw his father send up a distress signal. Then Theodore watched as his dad ran about the ship, first locating his mom, and then his father grabbed his two sisters, Charlotte and Beatrice. And then Theodore watched his father escort his wife and daughters onto the lifeboat. leaving Theodore to fend for himself. What would Theodore do? He committed his life into God's hands. He hoped for the best. He took the helm, piloted the ship through the storm, and eventually, 36 hours later, the wind and the seas calmed, and Theodore thanked God that he was alive. Now we have a controversy over who is the rightful owner of the ship. Our property laws uphold the principle of stewardship. This includes those laws governing inheritance as well as laws about ships abandoned at sea. The principle of stewardship holds the two laws together. Don't let the elder Mr. Withers corner you into some false dilemma. Mr. Withers handed his ship over to destruction by wind and waves. So far as he was concerned, the vessel was going to break apart, leaving planks and rigging scattered as flotsam across the waves and so much debris to rest on the sea floor. In that moment, when Mr. Withers took to the lifeboats, he considered that vessel no longer an intact ship, let alone his own property. But Theodore remained. Theodore piloted the ship through the storm. Saving the vessel was tantamount for him as an act of creation. Theodore took control of a vessel as if to fashion it out of the stuff that his father had treated as formless and void. The planks and rigging and all the rest of it were certainly ownerless, and Theodore resurrected that ship. Today, after the storm is past, Mr. Withers wants to remind us of the law of inheritance, as if it had some bearing on today's case. He wants you to overlook the principle of stewardship. Our inheritance law that he relies on aims to steward family property. Of course, a father shouldn't hand over the fruits of his labor to some dissolute son. A dissolute son would not steward what his father had worked for. So I join with Withers. I commend the inheritance law. We ought not to leave the property. We ought to leave the property to the care of the careful and not to the care of the dissolute. But do not allow Withers to treat the law of inheritance as some kind of wax nose that he can reshape into anything that suits a bitter father's whim. Withers would have you force fit a sensible inheritance law into what's plainly a maritime case. He wants you to remove a ship from the care of the person who preserved it and hand it over to the very same individual who had handed it over to destruction. When Withers appeals to the inheritance law, he undercuts the very principle of stewardship that our lawmakers embraced when they enacted it. So, mind this principle of stewardship. Even the law of inheritance would give this unattended ship over to Theodore's care. Don't think that Theodore would be inheriting any property of his father. Of course, that would be illegal. Theodore simply took possession of an abandoned vessel that at that moment belonged to nobody whatsoever. Now, what about our maritime law? When our legislature laid down the laws of the sea, they pointed to the North Star of stewardship. Look at the law. First, the law says an ownerless item can be claimed by whoever cares for it. And second, if an owner delivers his property over to chance and destruction, in other words, if he surrenders his claim to ownership, then he's no longer the owner. So an abandoned ship is a ship with no owner. And any person who takes an abandoned ship into his care makes himself the new owner. Now, as for the inheritance law, the evidence in this case shows that the law was satisfied, indeed, by an act of God. Withers bequeathed his ship not to his disinherited son, but to the wind and the waves. So the terms of inheritance law are clearly satisfied in this case. All that remains is to carry out the terms of maritime law. Theodore took possession of a dispossessed ship. Your task, members of this jury, is simply this: apply the law. When wise Solomon had to settle a dispute between two women who claimed the rights of motherhood over the same child, Solomon taught us where wisdom lies. The true mother is not the one who leaves a child to destruction. She's the one who cares for that child. So which one cared for the ship, Withers or his son Theodore? Which man handed the ship over to destruction, and which man took it into his care? The hard truth is that Withers treated the ship just like he treated his son. Withers cast his son Theodore out of the family. Now that's his prerogative as a father, so be it. Now let the same be so when Withers cast his ship out of the family when he consigned the ship to the mercy of the storm. Theodore's courage in the storm has proved to us all that Theodore was not the dissolute that his father claimed him to be. And now Withers shamelessly tries to extract even more from Theodore by taking property that now belongs to Theodore by right of maritime law. Withers, Theodore is no longer your son. And since he is no longer your son, you no longer have any claim to what is his. Members of the jury, follow the laws of stewardship. Give over this ship to the one who cared for it, for I know you will find for Theodore in this case. And so I leave the property of a brave young steward into your hands. There you go. You can't research for that. That's just my attempt to show you what it looks like, and I've just followed the basic heads from an ancient rhetorical treatise. And it teaches students to craft arguments, and then you're going to have a student argue the other side following similar heads like that. That's what declamation looks like. And in the workshop later, we're actually going to walk through one together and craft a speech and show you what it looks like. But there's, as an introduction to the kind of exercise I'm commending to you. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Well, now it's time to take some questions. I have some things that came to my mind as well. Start us off. But if you have some questions, feel free to step up to the.
Yeah, how dare you do that to your son?
Yeah, that's right. I'm convinced by it. So I think a lot of great content and a lot of great questions. I think if we're thinking about our classrooms or our schools that we're at, and let's say we fulfilled your dream, we got rid of the thesis, and we go with declamations. I think a lot of us would wonder where do we start? Because of the common practice of the thesis, there's a lot of resources out there. How would you get someone started who's really interested in doing this in their schools?
I think the first place to start is for teachers to start playing with the exercises themselves. Remember that these are mature exercises. Think about, I think we would say the same thing, we would have said the same thing for thesis. You know, would you have somebody overseeing a thesis regime who themselves hasn't researched, who themselves hasn't written, who themselves hasn't, So I think the key thing is teacher training, and for teachers to start learning this practice. Remember that the mature Romans continued practicing this. It's like, think about war games, war games where you don't send somebody off into Afghanistan or into Ukraine, into a war zone without, staging some simulations. And these are the simulations that are intended to most closely imitate real life, which is why they're good practice. And I think that the teachers themselves, that's really where it starts. I know, start a club or something at your school where you do this. And I would actually take some time doing that as the starting piece and get a vision for how they look like, how they feel, what hang-ups do you run into, and then roll it out to your students. I think I'm talking about a long game here. If we're trying to think about plug and play, I'm going to disappoint you. That's not the answer. So that's the start. And a second note is that I'm working on a text that's about 90% done that kind of walks through all of these and walks through the steps and has lots and lots of sample problems. Which
is great. As a follow-up to that, in terms of ancient sources, where would you point people to? Let's say they wanted to start a club or they wanted to start working through some of these exercises themselves. Where would you point people to start?
Yes, the key sources would be Cicero's work De Inventione and the Rhetorica ad Herennium, which is a Ciceronian treatise. Most of the space or attention in these texts is on stasis theory, which is interesting. I think a lot of people who read those texts tend to treat that as flyover territory, when in fact it was foregrounded in those texts. And then another excellent one, although it's very expensive, Oxford University Press, is Hermogenes on Issues. Hermogenes on Issues, edited by Malcolm Heath. So those would be the three ancient sources. And my text is trying to sort of translate the ancient sources into contemporary classroom environment.
Yeah, Yeah, we can just turn it over to the audience.
Yeah, so I'm overseeing a senior thesis right now, and he's wanting to handle friendship. So I'm trying to piece together, like, let's say we were to transition some of these things where however, you see a lot of seniors who they're kind of just supposed to be describing something or proving a certain point about this is the ideal friendship, right?
Right.
So would aiming toward declamation, aside from the spoken one that clearly needs to occur, would you also suggest like creating conflict scenarios about this, like this is what the friend did, would we call this true friendship? That way maybe it starts. There's a lot more there to work with rather than just abstract concepts of friendship, right?
Yes, I think. First of all, when you talk about a thesis on friendship, I'm going to translate that into ancient categories. If you're familiar with progymnosmata, you're actually talking about what the ancients would have called thesis as a progym exercise, where you're working around that virtue of friendship and probably advising someone to pursue friendships, would be a thesis proposition that would be put forward as one of the more mature exercises. And in saying that, what I want to point out is that I don't think that what you're doing is a waste of time right now. It's not like theses are a waste of time, flush that for declamation. No, it's a comparative goods here. And I think that within your curriculum, the sort of thing that you're getting at is important and should be preserved and not jettisoned. So I want to be clear about that. But these kinds of controversies, I think, actually draw upon some of that preliminary work of principles. We've got virtues that have to come forward. You can see how hopefully I tried to, through that illustration of that speech that I suggested, how you're summoning a lot, marshaling a lot from your whole curriculum to bring it to bear in this one exercise. And I hope it was a demonstration of that fact. So it would depend upon preliminary work on friendship and things like that. So that's how I would frame that.
Yeah, it's sort of related to that. I have a sort of pretentious academic question related to a very practical question.
I love pretentious academic questions.
Yeah, so I teach a class on history of liberal arts education, and I talk about this kind of stuff, although I've never really understood what it looks like in practice, so I thank you greatly for your presentation. But so Father Aubrey Blank's book, like Roman Education from Cicero to Quintilian, he talks about this kind of exercise. He says there was a real sort of degeneration from Cicero to Quintilian, and Quintilian is very much like a Ciceronian who's trying to
Right.
keep this the authenticity of this practice intact. But he basically gives examples like the plots that you have.
Right.
And he says these are kind of like this unreal law code that are kind of like, it's fantastical. You've got pirates, rich heiresses, and bizarre laws. And it's like, where's the law code come from? Like, what are these? And it kind of just, he criticizes it because he says, this is actually divorced from the real oratorical practices that Cicero is engaged in, because you actually have the necessity for statesmanship in a republic, whereas like by Quintilian's time, it's just imperial as a kind of language game or something like that. And I never really understood that criticism because, as you showed with the contrast of debate, what you really want to do is draw on a sort of human understanding of these questions of justice and,
Right.
and virtue and ability and things, that you want to be able to bring those to bear rather than just a kind of footnote chasing game.
Right.
Where you're sort of doing a pretend research paper or something. So I like that argument. But my question is just like, how do you, what would be, so the practical question is, what's a practical example of what a conflict that would look like in a contemporary K-12 classroom that would not be a sort of invitation for sort of ridiculous fancy or something, but would really relate,
Right.
without
Right. Yeah, so first of all, the literature you're alluding to, Quintilian is going to be central to it. This is the Silver Age literature. Tacitus has this great treatise on the decline of oratory. Suetonius is writing at the same time, and what had happened basically is that as we move into the early empire, this oratorical tradition no longer has, basically the emperor and his cronies decide things, right? And so debate and discussion is no longer has the policy implications that it used to have. Therefore, it becomes entertainment. And so the laugh lines and the applause lines are what wind up gaining traction. Quintilian basically points this out. He says, any speech that a young person gives has that danger. So this is not particular to declamation, first of all, but the danger is real. The danger is real. So you just need to be the good kind of teacher to police it. Just like you have to police this with any other speech exercise that young people are doing, knowing that it's an exercise, right? So I don't think that this is a unique temptation to declamation. It's just a temptation to speech exercises, which we're all on board with. Okay, some kind of speech exercise, right? And I would, moreover, go on to say that if you're familiar with policy debate has degenerated into, with spreading and that sort of thing, and I think this is the key thing, if you need to be a super well-trained judge to even follow what's happening, then debate and the culture of high school debate is untethered from reality and real conversation. I would say that criticism is an important criticism. I think that actually that's an indictment to where debate has gone in today's high schools. So teachers just need to police it with sensible instruction. And I don't know, bring parents around as jurors who are sensible people yet not practiced in the craft necessarily. This should be plain folk argument, right? So, yeah.
So if you were tasked to bring this type of exercise down from like a high school level maybe to a middle school level,
right,
where would you start with that? Would it just be about changing the prompt, or is there more structurally you would kind of scaffold them up into?
Yes, I would say that these exercises are the most mature exercises. They would be mature sophomores, junior, senior exercises, first of all. So I wouldn't throw this to a junior high kid. These are capstone exercises. Now, but I am all for eloquence and rhetorical training in the junior high with the junior high kids. And I think that if you work with progymnasmata, which I'm happy to work with, if you understand these exercises, it's going to shape the culture of the progym too. And that's another thing where once teachers kind of get a feel for that, sometimes, I'm going to do a CREA and it becomes this, then I do CREA as it's the whole thing. That's just as bizarre as, again, a ball handling drill. Let's do the ball handling drill for the sake of the ball handling drill. That's just weird. That's weird, right? But that's the sort of thing you're doing with the junior high kids, and the good teacher knows where this is headed.